Hi everyone, my name is Chanidu, and I'll be discussing the round 3 motion from the recently concluded RI debating tournament. The motion reads, this house will allow people raised in isolated communities to sue their communities for harms caused by their lifestyle. I'll first be discussing proposition and then opposition. Beginning with proposition, first let's discuss setup. I think the most important point of setup that proposition should have in this debate is a model of what the process of suing a community looks like. And you can have this because this is a this house would motion, which gives you fiat to implement model. Some things that you might want to consider when thinking about the model is first, who are you likely to be suing in the community? After all, it doesn't really make practical or legal sense to sue the entire community at large. So it's likely to be, for example, community leaders. In indigenous communities, this might be elected tribal leaders. In religious communities like the Mormon church, this might be church elders. Secondly, you might want to consider what exactly you are suing the community for. The motion alludes to harms caused by lifestyle, but what might these harms be? First, you might point out that there are harms associated with merely living in an isolated community. For example, less access to modern technology, less access to opportunities for things like a traditional career. Secondly, you might point out that living in an isolated community also increases the likelihood of things like psychological or emotional abuse due to ideological brainwashing, for example, by a very orthodox religious community, or even things like physical abuse by leaders of the community, which can often go unchecked due to how small and isolated the community is. Thirdly, you might want to show that the process of suing and what it looks like, you might want to illustrate that. For example, you might point out that it's like any other civil trial. The burden of proof that you need to meet is that on a balance of probabilities, harms are likely to have been caused or have been caused. You might point out that this is the same as any other trial. You are allowed to present evidence. You go in front of a judge. Witness testimony are things that might be considered. And finally, you might point out that at the conclusion of this trial, damages might be given to the victims. For example, they might be given monetary compensation in exchange for the harms caused by their lifestyle. You might also want to point out that, like other civil suits, this could also become a class action lawsuit where many people from the community come together to collectively sue for harms caused by their lifestyle. This becomes relevant later in argumentation because you can use it to point out why these trials are likely to be successful, even if it is somewhat difficult to get things like witness testimony or evidence, given the general reluctance of the community to speak out against abuses, as well as the fact that these crimes might have happened during the childhood of the people who are suing, and so physical evidence might not be accessible. Having proven that setup, then, we can move on to arguments. I think the most important argument for proposition in this debate is proving why this leads to the liberalization of isolated communities. To make this argument, you first need to establish what exactly an isolated community looks like and why it can be harmful to people and why therefore there is a right to sue. First, you might want to point out some obvious direct harms of living in an isolated community. A few of these we've briefly discussed already in our model. For example, isolation leading to a lack of access to opportunities, or things like emotional and physical abuse. But you might also want to point out that the reason that these communities choose to live as isolated communities is because there are some elements of their lifestyle or some values that they have which are incompatible with the modern world, which might also lead to a series of harms. For example, in the Mormon church, the use of modern medical technologies like blood transfusions is strictly prohibited, and that might lead to a very direct harm. For example, if you're not allowed a blood transfusion, which led to critical health problems, or if you're denied of the opportunity to have access to modern technology like vaccinations. Secondly, you might point out that these communities also live very rural, traditional lifestyles, which also means many outdated social practices might be preserved in these communities. For example, the expectation that women are the primary caretakers of children and are not allowed to have a traditional career in the same way that men are. So those are some reasons for why living in an isolated community can be harmful. You could go a step further and point out that these harms are worsened by the fact that it's very difficult for people to leave an isolated community. This is because they're often not equipped with the skills to be able to deal with the modern world. For example, you don't have a lot of employable skills. For example, if you are a member of the Amish community who live a rural agrarian lifestyle, you probably haven't had a formal education. And so finding a job outside of living and working on a pasture or on a farm might be very difficult, which also further proves why if people do end up leaving this community, they have probably undergone significant difficulties in doing so. For example, ostracization by their family, who see them as betraying the values of the community, which further adds to this point that these people have a right to sue. But all of that simply establishes that a problem exists and that people have a right to sue. What we're trying to prove in this argument is that this leads to the liberalization of isolated communities at large. There are a number of ways that we can do this. First, you might point out that suing is a very good accountability mechanism because it changes the incentives of errant community leaders. Community leaders in many cases are responsible for preserving the bad practices within isolated communities. After all, these are the people that are responsible for teaching doctrine. If it's a religious community, they're the people responsible for preserving traditional practices if, for example, it's an indigenous community. For these people, their incentives might change in a number of ways. First, it is probably their money that they are losing if the civil suit is successful and the victims can claim compensation and damages. But more importantly, a successful trial against them, and even not just a successful trial, but rather any trial against them, also leads to a massive harm to the reputation of these leaders. After all, many of them probably rely on, if, for example, you're in a religious community, being morally pure as a justification for why they should hold a leadership position. And even if not that, at least the fact that they can unite the community and can make decisions in the best interests of everyone. For example, if you're a native tribal leader. And so when a former member of the community is suing you for damages caused by this lifestyle, this leads to greater distrust within the community about whether you should maintain that leadership position. So that changes the incentives of leaders. The second thing that you might point out is that even the process of a trial can be beneficial in terms of opening up the community to more information about the outside world. After all, as we detailed in setup, the process of a trial requires you to give witness testimony, to present evidence, and it also requires a former member of this community to come back to the community in some sense, to interact with members of the community, to persuade them to give testimony, or to at least meet them in court. And all of those might be reasons for why people in highly isolated communities, for example, the Amish, who don't have access to modern technology like cell phones, might learn more about the outside world. The third is that this also probably harms the image of the community at large. After all, these communities are often given legal protections to maintain their isolated lifestyle. For example, the Amish are allowed to educate their own children rather than sending them to traditional schools because the state thinks that this is necessary in order for them to preserve their isolated community. But retaining these rights is preconditioned on these communities maintaining the image that they do care about their members and they are not excessively hurting them. And so for those reasons, even if not from community leaders, at least from the community at large, there's likely to be a great awareness of the importance of liberalizing. What impacts are these likely to have? I think it's both unrealistic and not beneficial for proposition to argue that this will lead to the dismantling of isolated communities. After all, some of these communities might be very important to particular members. For example, indigenous people who really value their indigenous identity and want to preserve certain aspects of their lifestyle. Rather, what you are likely to argue for is that you reach a middle ground where isolated communities give people more opportunities to leave the community and generally adopt a more liberal lifestyle while maintaining certain traditional practices. This could look like, firstly, preemptively liberalizing before a suit is brought against you in the first place, because you don't want the harms to your reputation or to the image of the community if you are a community leader. This is true even if only a small number of people actually end up suing, and even if you are not directly sued, because it's about the potential or the threat that you might face of future legal action. This might lead to positive community practices. For example, among the Amish, there's a common community practice of allowing 18-year-olds to, and this is a mandated practice, leave the community and be exposed to the modern world for a period of time and then decide whether they want to stay or leave. This is called a Rumspringa. And within the community, it might lead to better reforms. For example, better treatment of women, giving them access to more traditional career opportunities, such as in the Mormon church, where they have now significantly liberalized and women are allowed to have careers. Secondly, this might lead to reforms within the leadership of isolated communities. For example, people might be far less willing to tolerate extremist leaders who preach very ultra-orthodox doctrine, because these people are likely to be viewed as a threat to the community, because in the future, a former community member could come back and accuse these leaders of ideological brainwashing, and this might lead to harms to the community at large when they are perceived negatively and the government decides to take away their rights to educate their own children, as we discussed previously. So for this reason, perhaps you are likely to elect or select better community leaders who maintain the traditional lifestyle but don't do so in an extremist fashion. Moving on now to opposition. First, beginning with opposition's countermodel, the first thing that you can prove here is that courts are, in the majority of cases, inaccessible to people. So even if you do allow people to technically sue their communities, it's only a small number of people who can do this. You can prove that this is true for a number of reasons. First, personally, many of these people probably don't have the time or money or resources if they are still living in the isolated community to be able to sue them. For example, you might not know that this kind of law has been passed that allows you to sue. You might not know what the process is. You might not have access to a lawyer. Secondly, as we previously discussed, even if you have left the community and you have the resources, you might not have the necessary evidence. For example, members of the community might not be willing to give evidence. You might not have access to physical evidence. And your own willingness to sue your community might be quite limited because you don't want to be perceived as betraying your family and your friends who you grew up with. And so for all of those reasons, it's only a small number of people that end up suing the community. And of those people, it's an even smaller percentage that actually end up successfully suing their community and receiving damages and mandating changes to the community. In contrast, opposition might argue that firstly, the community itself has incentives to liberalize, which we'll discuss in argumentation. Secondly, that the government can legislate against these communities. For example, mandating that people within the community have access to modern technology, or for example, mandating that they have some exposure to the outside world, such as by requiring them to attend public schools. Or thirdly, you might point out that in very extreme cases of things like physical abuse, you don't need to give these people the right to sue the community. You can simply allow them to take criminal action against the specific people responsible for physical abuse, such as by filing a police report. And you can prove why this is just as accessible as proposition's solution of allowing people to sue the community, if not more accessible, given that it's easier to report something to a police officer than to take someone to court in a lengthy process of a civil suit. Having established that setup and countermodel then, we can move on to what I think is the most important argument for opposition, which flips the proposition claim about isolated communities becoming more liberal and proves why you worsen extremism. So here we are flipping proposition's logic and conceding that certain isolated communities can be damaging to people and that lifestyles can be bad, but proving why allowing people to sue actually makes these communities more isolated. The first thing that we can say is that rather than preemptively liberalizing as an isolated community, you become even more isolated and restrictive due to the threat of a civil suit being brought against you. After all, if, as we set up earlier on, people can't actually access the courtrooms or don't actually leave the community, their ability to sue the community is quite limited. So this might mean that church leaders or tribal elders become even more restrictive in what they allow people to do. It means even less access to things like modern technology or news and information about the outside world because they fear the threat of legal action being brought against them in the future. But secondly, it might mean that many narratives within isolated communities are further justified by the government allowing people to sue. For example, the view that modern society and the outside world is actively trying to threaten the isolated communities and the traditional lifestyles that they live, therefore further antagonizing the outside world. The impacts that this might have is first, it might make it harder for people to leave the isolated community because now they are viewed as an active threat to the community even after they have left. So you're far more likely to be pressured by your family and friends to stay, or by church leaders. You are not likely to be given even the resources such as some exposure to the outside world or the Rumspringa that we discussed previously, given the significant threat. Comparatively on opposition, you might prove that if left to their own, isolated communities will naturally liberalize over time. The first thing that you might point out is that the forces of modernization are just so strong that no isolated community can fully resist them. For example, new technologies become necessary even to rural agrarian communities like the Amish because they need to do things like adopt new farming practices or have some engagement with the outside world to trade the farmed goods that they produce. Secondly, you might point out that younger members of the community, for example, teens, are naturally inquisitive about the outside world and will naturally discover things about it For example, they might go on social media, smuggle phones into the community, and so on. So modernization is inevitable. Given that this is the case, you might point out how community leaders preemptively want to allow people within the community some access to things like modern technologies. For example, allowing them access to social media or to television in order to not push people totally away from the community by making them choose between living within the community and adopting a modern lifestyle. So for those reasons, the incentives of leaders are also positive. You might also point out why these community leaders also in many cases care about doing things like having active support from within the community, because otherwise their leadership is seen as illegitimate. So for those reasons, isolated communities are likely to liberalize either way.